So we welcome Dr. V. Rajbabu from IIT Bombay. Dr. V. Rajbabu from IIT Bombay is a professor in Department of Electrical Engineering in IIT Bombay since 2007. He has pursued his PhD from Georgia Institute of Technology, USA. He has worked in L&T and MathWork USA from 1995 to 2001, and his research interest includes signal processing, image processing, audio processing, speech enhancements, uh, and he has also been associated to Technology Innovation Hub, IIT Bombay, for IoT applications. So we welcome Dr. Rajbabu for this particular session. And on behalf of SN Patel Institute of Technology, sir, you may start, sir.
Thanks for the introduction and good evening. So before starting, I just would like to get some. So I think most of them are faculty. Is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay. So this is the second day of the session. I mean the topic, right? IoT applications. This is the second day, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the previous talks, one I saw was just on healthcare, IoT for healthcare, and can
One
I
was
know?
in general talk. One was
Okay.
in general talk, and
Okay.
one more talk was on the challenges of IoT.
Okay.
Yeah.
And during the presentation, or participants allowed to ask questions, or is it muted? Is the mic muted and
Muted. No, sir. Generally, we keep it muted, and in the end only they ask questions. That will be if you want, we can change that also. They can ask in the chat if it is required.
Yeah, I mean, I think, see, the reason I'm asking is it's already close to dinner time, and I'm sure all of them are tired, or maybe not tired, I don't know. But I think again, the what I'm going to talk about is more, of course, the topic is IoT for agriculture. I will relate to that, and some data analysis relate to that. But also some feedback as to kind of what is that they are interested in, why they are, I mean, have they come across as things? Sometimes this may also help the other
Yes,
participants to
so
interact.
we'll keep their chats on, right? Will it
Yeah,
be fine?
certainly. I think, yeah, you can keep the chats, or at least to begin with, and even during the time. So if there are any questions, I think I
Yes,
can
sir. Chat will be
just
continuously on,
answer.
so they will be able to write in the chats.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so let me try sharing the screen and.
Yes.
Okay, is my screen visible?
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Okay, just 1 minute. Yeah, okay, good evening. So my name is Rajbabu. I am in the Electrical Engineering Department, IIT Bombay. What I plan to talk about today is, like as was mentioned in my introduction, I'm also associated with what we call as the Technology Innovation Hub here at IIT Bombay, with focus on IoT. And more specifically, since this, I thought others, there were no others talking about IoT in agriculture. So I thought I could talk about this. And it's not really, I would say, it somewhat relates to some of the research which we are doing under this topic. So it's not just strictly IoT, but it is trying to address problems related to IoT for agriculture. And more specifically, the focus or aspects which I will be focusing on is more on the data analytics side of IoT, in the sense that as you would have seen from the introduction to any IoT system, there are several components where starting from the sensors, things are sensed, then they are communicated, then you decide how they are communicated, then you decide where to store if they are to be stored. And once they're stored, you are kind of operating on this data, either to make some inferences or some analysis. And then based on that analysis, you kind of close a loop whether to do an action based on that activity. And then this is kind of a broad setup for IoT. So while I'll give you the picture of that for typical IoT system in the agriculture setting, my focus will be to a very specific kind of application and a problem. So please feel free to stop in between if there are any questions. I don't know how easily I can get the chat into because I don't seem to be seeing it immediately. So I would request if the organizers, Professor Ravish or anyone else is also following,
You are,
just
sir,
interrupt.
sure.
Yeah, interrupt me and I'll.
Sure, sir.
Yeah. And I would like to acknowledge some of the work which I carried out with Professor Mariam and Professor Arpita both and Professor Biplab. They're all at IIT Bombay. As you can see, they're all in different departments. This kind of also shows the breadth of IoT, that it is not just electrical engineering. It has other people also looking at it because of the challenges involved in such an IoT system. So let me move forward. Essentially, I will stick to a specific crop because in Maharashtra, onion is one of the crops which people are interested in because these are not crops where big players are there. Like it's not like grape where the interest is large, or it's not like mango. Instead, onions usually are by farmers who have smaller fields relatively, and which means maybe a technology intervention for them might be more effective than a technology intervention for, say, other crops, right? So that's kind of one of the reasons. And the way we are going to look at it is we are going to look at data analysis aspects and along with it the machine learning aspect in an IoT setting for these things mainly. Of course, I'll come to and say later there are many other problems which are related to any agricultural setup, but our focus will be mainly on pest or disease related to agriculture and how IoT systems will help them in handling such problems. Yeah, so just to give you an idea that so this is not, some of the aspects are not necessarily specific to onion, right? This can be generalized to other crop, but the main issue here is usually, so you can think of, when you think of agriculture, there are some things which are, let's say, pre-harvest, which means before the harvest of the crop or agriculture product. There are several things involved for the plant to grow, right? So during the growth of the crop or plant, you have to look at how the irrigation happens. And when the irrigation happens, there are several aspects which need to be monitored. And these monitoring will help us to kind of save either energy or cost or even other resources which are typically involved in having a good agricultural output, right? So in this case, for example, an unpredictable weather may lead to a poor quality of onion. Sudden rains may damage this onion crop, or sometimes there may be pests which attack the onion, and because of that, the quality or the output or a yield from a specific agriculture field may not be the thing which you wanted, right? Or sometimes they may lead to just bad quality products, right? The goal in usually this, so we are trying to kind of address, let's say, this unpredictable weather patterns. How could you build models or build IoT systems which could make some sense out of this weather patterns? Because there is not much of this available now. Of course, for other crop there are, and the government is also putting in a lot of effort in making this more useful for the end farmers. But our goal is to address such a problem at one level. So whether these weather patterns, not whether these weather patterns relate to, say, attack of some pest. So can we predict this attack of the pest based on past history of weather data, right? While the problem is not difficult, the challenge is for such this changes with each crop, right, and even region. So it's not that a model we develop in some other part of the country, you can just apply it in a specific part of the country and start doing it. So that's where the role of IoT comes into play, because you need to sense several parameters, and these sense parameters will keep changing depending on the region or the crop you are interested in. And the impact of this on the models will also keep changing. So you can't just build a model and use that model for all the crops which are available. So this is kind of the setup of the onion and the problem which are there for onion. But all of this is also applicable to many other crops which you are interested in, right? There may be other problems as well. It's not just the product yield quality, but once you have this product kind of coming out of the field, how do you transport this product to some remote distant or remote place and then maintain the quality, which means it will involve some storage of this for a certain time, right? This also is a part of the agriculture system. And if you kind of think of closing the entire agricultural life cycle of a crop or a product, there are many problems which come into it. So we will mainly focus on this, what happens while the crop grows and the yield comes out, how to determine the yield is going to be good. But as I said, there are other things which may also happen, which I'll touch upon some ideas in the later part of the talk, but I will not focus too much. Right? Now, focus more will be on the sensing part, identifying the diseases, if possible, classify them, and also see they can be predicted when this disease affects or attacks the plant. Right? Uh, so, of course, like as I said, there are several ways to address this problem. One is obviously to predict when this pest attack is supposed to happen or will happen, right? And then if you can predict, can you do something to either reduce the impact of the pest attack or even do something so that some corrective measures so that the effect of the pest will be smaller or not impact much of the crop, right? Similarly, there are other aspects where, like as I said, if you want to be energy efficient and also make sure that your yield is good, you have to do some intelligent irrigation, which is again kind of depends on several aspects. So, for example, not just the air, moisture, temperature, but also the soil, what type of soil, what is the temperature, and what kind of fertilizers adding to the soil may help the crop grow better, right? If you want to do that, then you need to probably estimate the parameters like NPK, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in the soil, so that uh, you can accordingly determine how much of this pesticides or other things, fertilizers, do you have to add to the thing so that the yield of this agricultural field is kind of matching the thing which you planned it for, right? So these things are more, I mean, they impact a smaller farmer much more than a large scale farmer, but essentially because this all comes at a cost. Like, do you invest in building such a sensor system which can give you all this feedback, or you just don't care and do what you want, right? So that's why at some point in time, while I can say yes, IoT is useful for agriculture and we should try to do it, but the cost analysis of such a system is very critical and even more critical for small farmers. And if at all some of you are like kind of interested in looking at it, then that should be the first problem which you need to address, whether the cost effectiveness of such a system, right? So in this, there are possibly different ways of handling this. I'm just going to present to you a system which usually we refer to as this DSS, which is a decision support system for farmers. Intelligent, I think you can add intelligent to anything, but this is more to say that there is less of human involvement in this loop, but at some point, if needed, humans could also be part of the system. Right? And this, I would say, is where the IoT setup comes into play, and you can relate this IoT setup to what you kind of already heard about the generic IoT system, and also to, let's say, IoT for healthcare. So what you would see is, as a system, there are not much differences between the, let's say, an IoT for healthcare or IoT for transport or IoT for industry. So they have many common things with, say, IoT for agriculture. And your goal would be to, what are the things you can optimize for the agriculture application, and what do you optimize for, say, for example, healthcare application, right? So that's kind of the challenge, which if you want to design an IoT system for agriculture, these are things you have to keep in mind. So the first aspect of it, like as I already mentioned, would be you would have several sensors sensing several aspects, both of the field, of the crop, and of the environment, right? So what kind of sensors you use, they all make a kind of impact on the cost, the quality, the accuracy, many other things, right? It's not just what, it also depends on how many such sensors you use, depending on the field you have. And again, you have to decide whether these sensors communicate among themselves, or they only communicate to something as a central node, right? So this again is something which is also critical. The question is, do we design something very specifically for agriculture, or do you exploit already existing technologies so that they suit the agriculture application, right? So this choice again depends on, as you would have seen, the kind of data you're transmitting over this network. For agriculture, the data which you communicate may not be large, which means you don't need a very high bandwidth, but you need large amounts of data to be transmitted at a slower rate if needed, right? So that, and then more importantly, what you may have is, you may need to have a reliable communication, because agriculture, if you think of, happens in rural areas where typically the communication networks may not be very strong. Of course, these things are changing nowadays in India, at least, where you have better connectivity even in smaller regions and villages, right? So the communication, so we talked about the sensing part, the communication part, and then, like, whether or not to do something locally or globally is something, again, you can design. Whether, let's say, for example, if you think of Maharashtra, there are several regions, and certain regions have a certain, let's say, weather patterns and things. So which means you may just be doing things within that region. Now, if you go to a different region, whether the similar model can be used there, or do they have to come up with a completely different model and different setup? Those things also are choices which you have to make. And then if you are going to do this thing, let's say, centrally, then you need to worry about that communicating to some central server and using that data from there, right? Once this data comes there, your job is now to kind of analyze this data. For us, this analysis is relating to the point which I mentioned in the previous slide, that the objective was for kind of coming up with cost-effective uh, solutions. Say, for example, getting better yield in an onion field, right? So that's kind of the goal. And with that goal in mind, we need to develop algorithms which work on this data, make some inferences, and then accordingly, let's say, either give feedback to the farmers, or maybe you give feedback to some agricultural scientists who look at this feedback, and then accordingly they give advice to this advisories to these farmers, right? So this is kind of the uh, framework or the system which we are trying to develop. Another aspect of this is what we refer to as this predictive data. So this is predictive in the sense, one is of course based on data which is being sensed and you act on the data. Predictive is, like as I mentioned in the previous slides, that you observe or monitor the weather for, let's say, a week or 2 weeks, and then based on certain patterns in the weather, can you predict that there is going to be a pest attack in the next 3 days or next week, so that such prediction may help the farmer to either apply a pesticide or a uh, 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 pesticide ahead of time, or wait for some time because we don't expect it to affect now, right? Of course, the question is that some of these things have been done by farmers in the past, but that is basically based on their past experience. So one goal would be to, can such past experience be kind of captured in certain way so that this experience is also built into this model, right? That is something for the future. But the point here is this predictive data analysis, which we are talking about for agricultural applications, is not something very mature. In certain countries, it is mature because their kind of style of farming and agriculture has been that way. But in countries like India, for this to be effective, we need to bring in more human elements, which is much more challenging. And right now, we are not looking at it. But I just want to highlight that part where this could be a feedback, a loop in which you could get inputs from a farmer and make these models better, right? Eventually, uh, sorry, eventually we have such a system wherein these data feeds into, like as would you expect, uh, maybe you provide an app which is there with the farmer, or it is with the computing platform is there with agriculture scientists or some agriculture centers, which get this data, make this analysis, and send back this feedback to the farmers, either over a mobile phone or, if possible, or a phone, right? Mobile phone is more prevalent and used popular in India. So any solution which kind of uh, leverages such a mobile use will always be effective. And like as I said, if there could be input from the farmer, that could also be brought back into the system. Right? So this is kind of the picture which we have for the problem which I just mentioned, in this case specifically for onion fields, like how do we build such a system, and then how do we kind of make it useful so that it's not just a research level problem solving exercise, but instead is actually should go, something should go to the farmer so that they actually can use it, so that this will help them improve their yield, right? So, so this is the kind of system which I mean we are envisioning. Like as I said, eventually there should be an alert which goes to the farmer, and then farmer can act upon it, and if not, give some feedback. Right. So what I would do just at this moment, just to kind of break some monotonicity, are there any general comments, questions, observations, or experience with of some of you with IoT in agriculture? And do you think there is some specific challenge which is there in the kind of problem which I just mentioned? I'll just wait for maybe 30 seconds if there are any questions, either on the chat, if some of you have, you can make, or even any other things. Say this is something you've done, or some things which you've done which have worked, not worked, whatever it is. So the first question, if it's not difficult, I'll just ask: can someone, if there are people who have done IoT for agriculture, you can say yes in the chat so that I know that people have done it, and I can see how many yeses are there, if possible.
Vera.
You will see the chat window.
Soil moisture, how to set up.
Is there a question? Somehow my chat is not loading. Let's see.
Yes. Can I read it for you, sir?
Sure, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now I see there are.
For soil moisture, how to set optimal threshold?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and I think that just directly goes into the problem. That's actually one of the interesting. So I didn't mention it, but as you would have seen in other IoT applications, so calibration of the sensors is very, very critical, right? That also includes in this case soil moisture. Right? Again, I'm not sure what optimal threshold here means, because here we are not looking for any threshold here, at least in the application which we are considering. We would like to sense the soil moisture, and then based on the soil moisture, we need to see whether this can be used as a part of the model which predicts something about the growth of the plant. right? It's not like, yeah, of course, I think the question, I think now I see, the question is probably to say, if I want to irrigate a field, yeah, if I want to irrigate a field, when do I, right? So that again depends on the crop and depends on the season which you are in, and there are several aspects. So which means the threshold has to be adaptive, as can be seen, because as I said, it depends on all these three things, like which kind of field you're using, what is the kind of crop you're using, what is the season which you're in, right? At summer, maybe you need to, you can't avoid having water, right? So yeah, the only thing I can say is typically as a kind of exercise, whenever we build such IoT system, when you develop the system, calibration is important because your sensor has to be very accurate. When you deploy the system, you need to come up with this threshold. So these are thresholds which have to be adapted. So that actually makes it more effective for IoT systems to be there, because you can remotely change this threshold from some central point and keep changing it depending on what you need, right? So that way, in the past, when IoT was costly, these things would be very difficult. You have to go physically to a sensor system, change this, and then see if that is working. Whereas now, with many such uh, cheap sensors available, I won't say soil sensor is not still cheap. With sensors and sensing systems and control and communications available, you could do this remotely, right? So that's yeah, I think that's a good question, but I would just answer it one. There are two aspects. One is calibration. The other is just setting threshold. This has to be done in an experimental way. Yeah, I think the other, now I can see the question. Yeah, land quality. Yeah, that question is, yeah, you have to first define what do you mean, not you, but we have to define what good quality land is for onion or any other crop. There is no direct measure, like, but I said the sensors like NPK and together with moisture, you could probably say, is the quality good or the soil rich in nutrients or not, right? So again, you can see now as an engineer, which I assume most of us are, most of you are here, we could come up with this sensing system, we can come up with sensors, but who says that this is the quality, right? So this essentially involves interacting with agricultural scientists. Only then I think any of this IoT system will be very useful. So for example, in this onion case, we are working with ICAR DOGR, which is specifically for onion and garlic research in India. So they give us some inputs. We kind of interact with them. We provide sensors. So it's a kind of multidisciplinary exercise which we are doing, and that is certainly needed. So rather than answering that, how do we measure? There are aspects which you can measure about land quality, which includes nutrients that you have sensors for. Again, is this good or bad quality? It depends on what you are looking for, what crop you are looking at, and then you decide, okay, this percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the soil is good enough. This is not good enough. So then how do you treat it with fertilizers so that the quality gets better, right? Okay, I think some of you have done some small projects. The next question is, can it be implemented for large scale, 5 acres? Yeah. So we started with, say, 1 acre, or small farmers who would have an acre, probably it's even large. But the goal is, can we scale up? So right now, ours are more in a prototype stage. Scaling is just cost kind of implication, more sensor deployment, and then the important part is, do you make decisions centrally or locally? If this 5 acres is in one region of the, let's say in Maharashtra, then maybe yes, it's not that difficult. But if this 5 region is spread out across different regions or different, let's say, villages, uh, then you have to consider other aspects of IoT, like communication and whether it is useful or not. And time
Sir,
analysis. Yes.
hello.
Yes.
Sir, I have one question.
Yeah.
Means how to deal IoT will how to deal with stochasticity, stochastic problems. Means
Yeah, I think
noisy.
yeah, I think that's a good question. So what I'll do is just hold on to the question. So I'm going to take a little bit of a deviation before just continuing with agriculture. At that point, I'll show why uh, data analysis for this time series data is challenging. Okay, so what we are dealing with in agriculture is uh, data which varies with time. And once data varies with time, what you mentioned now immediately comes into, like there will always be randomness in the kind of data you deal with. There will be in addition noise to the data which you have. So you need to first pre-process this data to handle noise. And then you look at, so this is not any more deterministic data. You can't just say, okay, this means that, right? So you have to apply probabilistic models on top of this data before actually making any inferences. So that actually makes it a challenging problem. That stochasticity which you mentioned, for example, the pest prediction problem, which I said, no, that's exactly that. I mean, we still can't say, because like, for example, the weather last year and the weather before, all this kind of changes very rapidly, meaning they are not stationary data. These are non-stationary data, non-stationary across years, right? So that way, to do a good analysis for agricultural problems, I think stochasticity and understanding of these models from a statistical point of view is very important. So as teachers and faculty who are taking this course, time series analysis in the past was very popular, and after some time it has not got much attention. But now if machine learning models or even other models have to become more effective for such a, this also applies to healthcare problems, right? So understanding how data behaves with time is something very effective. Like some of the models, all the data fitting models, that's how they were usually called. They're actually effective and you have to understand them better. Okay, so I didn't give you the answer, but I said, yes, it is challenging. I'll touch upon few of these things depending on time, but that is something important. At least as teachers and faculty, if there is one aspect of it that need to be looked at, certainly time series analysis of data for any problem, healthcare, IoT, industrial applications, everything is into the IoT domain, mainly because there are multiple sensors. These sensors sense several parameters which are very different, and the time scale at which they operate is also very different. So for example, temperature you may only look at every hour, soil moisture maybe every 4 hours, right? So all of this operate in a very different time scale. So if you have multiple inputs operating at multiple time scales, and then you want to build a model to do something, this is actually a good problem to work on, right? Of course, you need solutions for that. That's where we are now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think one question was trial and error. See, I think trial and error is, I would say, the starting point for some of these things. But what that trial and error essentially means, can you build these stochastic models in a more robust way, right? Until then, it would seem as if it is trial and error, which I think may not be very useful. And this will be the last question. I'll go back to my slide. It asks how many sensors are required for 1 acre. So this is actually again a good question. I will say later, I'll show just a research problem where just determining that could be a problem. Like how many sensors do you use, right? It's not like there can be several constraints for how many sensors you want to use. If you want to save cost, you may want to use just one sensor. But by one sensor, I mean it's a sensor system, right? It will have soil sensors, it will have weather sensors, it will have maybe, I don't know, nutrient sensors and so on. So do you deploy that for 1 acre? How many do you deploy depending on how things vary across your field? How do you know whether things are varying across your field? Again, you'll have to, like as was said, I don't know whether that was meant trial and error. You have to sample your soil at many points. How many points do you sample? This again is a signal processing problem wherein how do you actually sense meaningful information from a given data, right? So again, I don't give you an answer like I can use 5 sensors in 1 acre. No, it is, you have to decide what your sensor is going to do, and you need to know how varying things vary across your field. So for example, if your water and your water is flowing, you put moisture sensors at every meter or every 2 meter. It depends on the slope of the field, how quickly the field dries, which again depends on the temperature and other thing, right? So it's again an optimization problem. So many of these things, like as you can see, there are several things. One, the hardware, which is just the electrical engineering aspect of the problem. Then there are algorithms which you have to develop to optimize certain things, whether it's the optimization for the cost, optimization for the yield, or together, right? And then on top of it, you place this stochasticity, which was just asked. Things look interesting, and then eventually the problem may be very simple and solution may be simple. But will this solution actually help the farmer is the actual question, and that's a more difficult question to answer.
Validation.
Yeah, validate, and also validation is one part of it. After you validate, will the farmers use it, right? If we do all these things and if the farmer is not going to use it, then the question is, how do we make it usable, right? How do we make that they use it? So that actually is actually also an important part of IoT systems in general, which is the HCI. So if I build a very complicated system and I give to this farmer, he's not going to use it. It should be in a way that maybe he can talk in his local language, ask the way he wants to ask, and it should give him the feedback, right? So
Customization.
customization
Right.
and
And sir,
usability, right?
how to quantify that validation? Can we have some
Yeah, so
quantification
one
para?
quantification is, say, for example, you deploy the system and you look at the yield. That's a
Right.
objective quantification. Okay, with
Right.
this system, the yield per acre increased this much, right?
Yeah.
That is you can use it as a number to justify, let's say, the funding
So we
agency or
need to
the
have
trust.
a previous data that way, right,
Correct.
sir?
But we do, if
Yeah.
we don't have data, then what do we do, right? So we need to do some
Exactly.
comparison. So it's a kind of a problem which is just starting, uh, which I think in my view may be relatively easy to address. But the other problem beyond validation is acceptability and the impact of that, right? That I
Yes.
think why it may be a difficult thing to solve in terms of using IoT for. Government gives a lot of support, I think. There is a talk also about digital agriculture, digitizing everything. So you know exactly how much area each person has, where his field is, and what are the details of the field. Many of this actually are available even in India. Like these all data collected and it is there. How do we use it? How do we exploit it? I think that is where IoT system for agriculture will help. Okay. So let me now switch back. Hopefully
Yes, sir.
some of you are still keen and I think we'll get back. Yeah, so this is kind of the system which I think I mentioned, like we are interested in. I won't say we are completely done with this. We have made progress and we have touched upon several aspects of this. I'll say about few things and then do a brief detour to talk a little bit about this data analytics, which I wanted to talk about. Again, maybe it won't be sufficient in this just one lecture, but I think that part, my idea is to, since these are faculties involved in one of these courses, if at all you're teaching IoT, I think the breadth of this is very important. So teaching an IoT as a course is very, very difficult. But certain aspects of the IoT are common to the topics which you may be actually teaching already. So you can relate to. So at least as a system, this is what we wanted to develop. We want to develop this predictive or machine learning models, which take as input weather conditions, soil parameters. I'll come back later what this leaf lateness means. Says it's trying to understand kind of the growth of the plant, right? Based on the leaf lateness, you can say, is this a good plant or not? Based on these inputs, we want to develop a decision support system, which these things like maybe it can run a mobile app, the data visualization for this visualization is mainly for say agricultural scientists who may help them give feedback on because they may not understand the numbers which we have, but we can present to them in a form which they are more uh, used to, right? Based on that, we can this was what was already asked a bit about how do you decide the moisture content, whether it is good or bad, high or low, this deficiency, and then this pest attack and how these pest attacks can be related to changes in weather, right? Again, as I said, so this was not the first system which we are building. People have attempted such systems in the past, which uses several parameters. But I think, as I said, things change with the crop, with the environment, with the weather conditions. So these models cannot be kind of uh, designed once and used everywhere, right? They have to be designed according to the settings in the local environment and then adapted to do better in that setting. Uh, so one aspect of this problem, which we are kind of also focusing more on is, so I talked about the predictive part, which is based on the time series part. But one of the things which we want is we want some feedback on, say, for example, the quality of the crop, right? The quality of the crop can be based on the yield. That is, say, for example, in this case, onion. Once the onion comes out, we can see how good or bad the onion is. But we can also probably look at the health of the plant as the plant grows, right? Which is a very challenging thing. But we did a somewhat slightly easier, relatively easier thing is to monitor these plants through images and see if we can say at least there is a pest attack on the plant, right? If it is a pest attack, what kind of pest attack? So of course, this is not the predictive part. This is actually after the attack has happened. But if we can detect such attacks early on rather than much later in the life cycle of the crop, we could probably do some intervention and apply some, I know if needed, pesticides so that the pests can be killed or removed, right? So this is one aspect of the problem where we focused on. And this problem is, you can think of it as a standard image processing problem, as to take an image, analyze this image and see, can you classify these different aspects of the image, right? This part is, let's say, affected by pest, this part is not affected by pest. So overall, the field is affected by pest, right? So this is something which, if those of you are doing machine learning, will be able to kind of relate to easily. Please just take an image of the plant or the field and then do classification of the disease if there is a disease. But the challenge for us in this case was the way onion plant looks very different than other plants. So the leaf itself is not like a standard leaf. It's like a plant which is like a shoot. So this posed some challenge. Of course, the machine learning challenge is not, it is there, important. But I think for us, it was about how do you get even such data? And if you have data, how do you label that these are disease parts and not disease parts, right? So this, again, as I said, involves a lot of interaction with the agricultural scientists uh, between us and sometimes even the farmers, because farmers probably see this very early on. Can their input be used? Or if not, they just take an image and send it so that they don't have to do much. And if the feedback from the scientists can go immediately to them, maybe that will help the farmers, right? Immediately is not real time, as also was mentioned in healthcare. It is not maybe a 2 3 days or a day or a week, depending on the severity of the pest affecting the plant, right? So this is kind of what our main thing was, to build such good image analysis models which can detect and classify the kind of crops or pests affecting the crop. Right? So essentially, as I said, the data analysis part is essentially this, using the weather related parameters and soil related parameters. The image analysis part will help us do the classification and detection of the crop disease. And we coordinate this with agricultural agencies, mainly who will help us interact with farmers and also in help us collecting data. Like as there were questions about how to determine which is good soil or how much water and all. So these are usually done in a controlled field, right? So the agriculture scientists have several fields. One field where they actually don't do any intervention and just the crop grows on its own. In another field, they'll actually apply pesticides or fertilizers and see what is the impact of the plant growth. In another thing, they may actually like have a pest attacking the plant and see what is the impact. So this again involves a lot of experiments. It's not just on the paper. Some of the algorithms are easy on the paper, but this have to be developed in the field, or data from the field has to come, and then we have to do. So that actually it makes it, because of an IoT system, these things are relatively easy because these sensors are now very well understood. You can deploy them anywhere. You can collect data and store in a common place and then do the analysis, right? So that's kind of the uh, problem which we were trying to do. And like as I said, some of the main challenges are in just the data collection and labeling, which data corresponds to which field, whether there is an effect of pest and so on. Uh, Simple time series models will also help, which is essentially looking at correlation, but that alone may not help. We have to do something more. And like I said, there are other aspects when you deploy the sensors on the field. As was mentioned, how do you calibrate? The sensors may go bad over time. How do you relook at them? How do you understand there is a fault in the sensor? And then there is this part which I mentioned, right? Especially in India, like people follow certain practices. Can we bring them in? Because they're doing that for some reason, and which some of the agriculture scientists may understand. And then how do you bring that in this complete uh, decision support system, right? That's kind of one of the other things which we have. Uh, Again, I'll not talk much about this, but essentially we wanted this framework which will do some predictive data analysis in irrigation, something which we didn't worry about now, but that's certainly a open problem in agriculture. Open, I mean, it's still relevant to look at it. We focus mainly on prediction of disease and pest attack, and then how to integrate this either with standard existing wireless networks or come up with some certain communication networks which are very specific. I think what we realized is there is no reason to come up with a specific wireless communication system just for agriculture. It's better to exploit some of these systems existing, sometimes maybe just uh, Bluetooth for smaller communication, and if needed, Wi-Fi in a longer range communication, right? There are, of course, we also experimented with other systems like LoRa, like long range communication, but that is only probably for a very large agricultural field where you can invest in some costly servers and kind of thing. So I'll quickly do this part, which is the kind of the easier part, I would say, the machine learning part. So we take images of this RGB images of these plants and then apply some machine learning algorithm to see which parts of the leaves are affected or the plants are affected. So we built several models trying to do this. But as I said, data in these applications is very limited. One thing we started off with, there are such data sets for plants. One example is this plant village dataset, which has several leaves of several uh, crops or uh, vegetables and other things. And they were also affected by several diseases or pests, right? So this data set helped us getting started. For the aspect of IoT, this is not very critical, so I'll go a little faster on this. We did some training on this available data so that we can detect certain and classify certain diseases. But this was only a starting model, right? So we have a model which works well for this kind of data, which is clean, leaf-looking thing. But now we want to use that model for the onion kind of problem which we have, right? So then we typically, as is usually done in machine learning framework, we take this model, we use pre-trained model, we adapt it to the crop we want, and then use this model for our onion classification, for disease classification in onion. And in this case, we also tried for tomato because that was one of the crops which we were interested in. So here I'm not talking too much about this because these are very standard things in machine learning, which we can kind of look at and say how to get information or input from this. When you do such things, also it's important to analyze why certain things happen. So we use some of these tools called grad camps to say which part of the leaf led to a decision which the model made, right? So if there are questions about this, I can take later because they don't directly relate it to they don't directly relate to IoT, but that anyhow can be looked at, right? For specifically for onion, there were several classes of diseases we considered, like about say 7 classes. Again, the challenge here was we did not have in the beginning of the project, we did not have enough images on this. So we were kind of challenged in terms of data, and we really like where what I would say exploring several techniques in machine learning to make them work better. Like for example, this is how the different images for onion look like, right? This is anything different from the leaves which I showed you in the previous slides, right? These are not just leaves, these are shoots or cluster of shoots, or sometimes the closer part of the plant, right? But still, I would say that the machine learning models are so effective that we were able to actually do reasonably good even with such kind of data. But of course, after some uh, tweaking of the models and playing with the data sets, we can get like 85, 90% accuracies in at least detecting is this a healthy plant or a non-healthy plant, right? The reason why we are interested in detecting this healthy part is, like as I said, we want to predict, and if we can detect early on that there is a disease being affecting these plants, then we can accordingly tweak our prediction models and do the feedback part, right? So that is kind of the uh, role which these classification models play for. It's like a feedback mechanism. I'm treating it with some pesticides or fungicides. or treating with giving it some fertilizers, what is the impact of this? Like, this is just to give an idea of how such a thing is useful, right? Now, like as I said, I'll talk a little more about this time series prediction. I'll switch to a different set of slides. But before switching, this will probably give you a sense for some of you. Maybe some of you would have seen such weather stations. The thing is, the government also deploys such weather stations in several villages. Usually they have what are called this KVKs. This is Krishi Vikas Kendras, which supports such activities. So as a group of farmers, they deploy 1 or 2 weather stations in a village so that information is collected through these weather stations, and that information is used for analysis. So in this case, with the TIH, that the Technology Innovation Hub at IIT Bombay, they had developed such a system. Again, not the cheapest system, but we wanted to put things together in a way so that at least for Onion, when we do our experiments, we have some control over the different components of this weather station, right? Again, not all are important for what we want to do, but this is kind of thinking of it like if you want to build a standalone system, how do you build it? What are the things it should do, at least for Onion? So for example, as you can see, there are soil sensors, then there is this weather sensors. These are the main sensors. Then there are other things like, say, solar panel to get power for the system, some batteries, and the other aspect is just data logging. So this was the part which is relevant and useful to us. The part which is not shown here is that we also have, we can think of a camera taking images of a field, or someone in the field taking images of the crops and sending that data back, right? Or you can think of, rather than a person sending, maybe there is a drone flying over the field. The drone captures the images and sends back to the system. That, along with this IoT system which is shown here, will actually build the complete system, right? So these are different aspects. I mean, I will not have time to talk about everything. This is just to give you, from an IoT based setup, I mean, IoT point of view, this actually plays a key role. That what is the sensing system, what are the parameters it is sensing, and how this is going to be used, right? So sometimes it can be there are many weather stations, they all feed to one of these stations. Some analysis is done. Here there is no analysis. This is just logging, right? This log data has to be communicated to some central system where the analysis is done. And then based on the analysis, as I said, there could be some action either from the cloud, or maybe you instruct the local farmer to do something, right? So this is a system which has been deployed, and it has been recording data, again, in coordination with scientists at the DOGR Pune, where they deploy some of this thing in their test fields, and also some farmers also have these fields. The data being collected there is analyzed for some useful analysis. So one such analysis is what I want to show here. Again, this is, I would say, work in progress. It's not that this is concretely done and this is very robust that you can just deploy it in the field. But this will give you a motivation as to why would someone build such a system, right? The goal here was to see if we can predict thrips incidents, and if we can predict thrips incidents, how will thrips is a kind of pest which affects several crops, but it also affects onion. Okay? And if it can be predicted ahead of time, how one could save certain time, or if you know the thrips not going to attack, then why apply pesticides when they are not needed at all, right? Meaning you don't have to treat when there is actually no need for treatment, because farmers usually have a cycle and they treat this irrespective of whether the pest is there or not, right? So the analysis which we have here kind of showed that no, you don't have to, based on the predictions you make, you don't have to apply pests over a certain period because any of the pests will not be there. So don't waste pesticide, right? Just not applying for a certain time will save in certain amount of pesticides being sprayed, which is a direct saving of cost incurred in pesticide, right? And the way we did this was, like for example, the way it's showed here, these are test fields in that DOGR, that the agricultural field. They took two types of treatment. One is certain periodic treatment, and then other is when the thing goes high, you apply and so on, right? So you can observe that. So these are the input parameters. It's a average temperature and average relative humidity. There are several things which we sense, but what we realize is, at least to predict that there is a pest attack, these parameters together just correlate better with the thrips incident. So for example, if the relative humidity is going down and temperature is somewhat in the increasing range, then you will see that the thrips count has increased. And when the temperature goes high and the relative humidity is kind of low, then you'll see that the thrips incidence rates have come down, right? So essentially what we could do is if you focus on the plot on the, by plot, I mean the figure on the right side bottom corner, we show this different kinds of fields. This R2 is one field, R1 is the other field, and the R2 with a different kind of treatment is this other different field, right? So you can see that, so this region, right, this blue line here, there is no thrips attack during that region. So what one could do is, for example, this, if you see the timeline between February 25th to March 4th, there is almost no thrip and there is no point in applying pesticides here, right? So if this model which we have uses this data and temperature and relative humidity and say during these regions you are not going to get any thrips attack, then the farmer doesn't have to apply any of this pesticide during this time. So this was not done, and the farmers were always applying, let's say, periodically pesticide. In the beginning, it makes sense because there is actually thrips attack, and so this will help in applying this pesticide will help in reducing the thrip attack. But later in the cycle, there is no need for applying this pesticide, right? Of course, what we are saying is these, for example, from March 4th onwards, this can be predicted by this model which is shown here. It will say, okay, from next week, don't apply pesticide because I'm not expecting any thrip attack based on what I've seen, right? This is kind of the confidence which the model can give, but just one time doing this will not help. We'll have to use data from several years in the past and run this model multiple times to make sure. So what I wanted to kind of highlight and bring kind of to this slide is, it is an IoT based system because these inputs were obtained from an IoT based system. As there are questions about how do you determine certain parameters, all these sensors, though they are well time tested, there are always noise in the systems over a period. So you need to be aware of how to remove such noise. And even if you are kind of handling this noise and if you have data, clean data, how do you do correlation between these two data and the thrips here, right? Okay, this works for this year. Will this work for the next year? That is a question which we are trying to answer. We know certain things are easier to predict and certain things are more difficult to predict. So this is again a question we are trying to answer. Which models do this well for what kind of data? The stochasticity and other things which I think was also asked as a question. Essentially, it has to do with this data, right? You can see this is not just one deterministic data. This is a data with certain mean, certain variance, and also there is some periodicity to this. I'll show some in a while how such periodicity occurs in agriculture related data, but that's kind of where and that's why this problem becomes interesting to us also, that if we actually make these models do well, we can actually lead to some cost saving. How much is the cost saving and at what cost is the question that one has to answer. And if the answer is, yeah, maybe not a significant saving, but even a small amount of saving in this will help us reduce cost in pesticide, and that's something we should do, right? So let me just go back to this other point which I wanted to say, where I will show briefly about some of this, let's see, the ideas on this time series for data analysis relevant to agriculture, but not specifically to agriculture, but any of the time series model, right? So I'll briefly touch upon it just to show that, yes, these are things which can be done. And then I'll go to few other very high level applications of IoT like systems in agriculture. At this point, are there any questions? Okay, if they are not, I mean, again, this I just thought because any of there was a question and I should just touch upon some of these things. Uh, uh, so one of the things which this sensors will help in an IoT data analysis for IoT systems is it's not just this, it doesn't make the decision support system work well. It also helps us understand if there are sensors which are faulty in the system, right? So that's kind of also a role which the data analysis plays in an IoT setup, okay? Not necessarily agriculture, in any of the centers, see any of the applications. Just analyzing the data which the several sensors in an IoT system collect, that itself will say you also the quality of the sensors and the effects or defects or noise which may be there in the data, right? I'll skip this part, which is not very relevant to here. What I wanted to talk about are these other things, right? So for example, there are several, how do you make sense of this time series data? There are several things. One of the things is on this regression type analysis. So this is a kind of a very simple thing, right? If you're more or less deterministic, then a basic regression to fit the data which you observed may be sufficient. Again, it's just not usually single parameter regression. You would have multiple parameters here, right? So then how do you, like, for example, so this is the error function you have, and you'll have to minimize this error function so that your model does well. One of the things which will happen usually in the data is, these are again some basic statistical ideas. Just looking at the different parameters which are sensed and your observations or the errors, you could see whether are there some correlation between a parameter and the entity you're trying to estimate. So for example, in our case, will measuring temperature help us predict the pest number, right? That is a thing which is of interest. So if they are positively correlated, then that means you can at least say, oh yes, measures and temperature, so you can predict the pest number. But if you have something like this, there is no trend, that is, it is independent of the temperature, then there is no point in sensing that parameter for that application, right? So these choices of which sensor use and which, depending on the estimates which you are interested in, also is a critical part of an IoT system. And hence you'll have to look at the data which is captured by such system. And there are always several measures which say, are these parameters good enough by sensing this uh, parameters? That's something which you can measure. Again, there are these measures which people typically talk about, like R squared or the goodness of fit measures, which help you decide, is this model good enough, right? One of the models which typically is used in such agricultural applications is this multivariate linear regression, where you have these multiple variables, x1 up to xk. They all kind of help you make some inference, right? In our case, the inference is there going to be a pest impact on the field or no? So which means you have to decide what kind of data you use to represent, right? What you can see is based on the data, there is usually some kind of trends and some kind of variation which year or variation over a specific set of seasons. So for example, in a year, you'll have 2, 3 seasons and you'll see that repeating patterns every season in every year. So can you make sense of these patterns and can you apply them in your problem, right? That's something which is very useful. This is just some example, again, not very directly relevant to the problem, but this is what it says is the data can be just stationary where it mean and variance will not change with time. But the data which we have, let's say in agriculture like application, may be non-stationary. It will have a mean over a certain time, a different mean over a certain time, or variance over a certain time. And there will be kind of things happening every season. There is a variation in, let's say, the weather, and accordingly the pest attack and so on. But identifying this and cleaning this up is something very challenging. Okay. I'll just show, yeah. So these are some of the, what I wanted to show was if you're really keen on such things related to agriculture, the ICAR, which is the Agricultural Research, Indian Center for Agricultural Research, they have certain, at least one website, which at least for the problem which I am considering, which is the decision support system, mainly for crop, there are several crops which they have considered, and you can get some relevant data. So, for example, in this case, there are this pest and weather data for different crops here, right? For whatever crop you want, they have stored or recorded this data for many years in the past, right? One could usually get this data, and only caveat there is this data is not labeled so well, so you have to be careful that you are using it for the right purpose and right analysis and so on. And let me get back. So I know it was a quick deviation, but I just wanted to say it. I'd like to know how much time do I have? Yeah, I think there is a question already. How to collect the data? How much interval it should be? Can I use the Kaggle data? I mean, I think it's Kaggle data. So if you're interested in agriculture data, like the one which I showed, which is the crop-based DSS, that's a useful site to check and see if we can use it. I mean, it's not all crops. It's at least certain crops and certain pests which affect the several of the crops which are popular in India. And ICAR has several, and I think again with the Indian data, Indian government, other department, there are several departments which have data, but just that this data is not very well curated. It takes a lot of time to clean them up, make some sense out of it. So it's always useful if you can interact or collaborate with one of these ICAR centers so that they know what the data is about. So how much interval, like as I said, like depending on the parameter you're sensing, you may need hourly or sometimes maybe daily data, right? So it may not be needing hourly. But it's a relevant question because, so for example, the sensors which are used for weather station by IMD, they collect, I think, data every, I don't know, every hour or so. Whereas if we have only every other data, something misses in between, or something interesting happens in the time, how do you take, right? So always higher sampling helps, but then if you sample it at a much higher rate, your amount of data is going to be huge. Storing them, transmitting them, everything is going to be costly. So I think that's why it's an important question, like how much interval it should be. It depends on the problem you're trying to solve, right? Most of the agriculture problems are not real-time problems. You're always going to store them. So if you have enough storage, sample it as much as you can and store it and then analysis later. I think that's all the question I had. So sorry, I'm rushing through, but I just wanted to show one more thing, which is kind of maybe relevant. So far, I only talked about this machine learning based classification problem, and then a bit about this time series data. The other aspect which is relevant to agriculture is also this. So some few problems I'll just highlight, and then I think I will see if we can maybe wrap up if needed. So one aspect which I was talking about is deciding what kind of communication is needed, right? So when we say what kind of communication, there are several things, right? So for example, like what kind of service do you want? Like, is it within a field or across field, right? And also the other part is sometimes this data becomes kind of security relevant thing. Like sometimes farmers may not share all the data which they have. They don't want to share it with others, right? So how do you kind of use this data, but without violating their privacy and other things, and at the same time authenticate this data is good, right? So there are several these things relate to both the cloud-based setup and as well as the local deployment of such communication protocols. This is again nothing very specific to agriculture, but one could consider when you're considering agriculture. The other part, which was again touched about in the, I think the previous one also, when they were talking about healthcare, is there may be times when we want to do local analysis. In the local analysis, we may have to deploy some kind of edge platforms, which means low power algorithm which run very efficiently so that you can achieve actually what you wanted to achieve. Right? We have done some work in this, but maybe not. But the challenge again there is if you want to run these on very low power devices without compensating on the quality or the uh, estimates which you have, how do you do it? How do you do it intelligently? So again, it may look like it's machine learning. Yes, it's machine learning, but machine learning in a kind of a distributed setting. So for example, a federated learning kind of thing, because you have multiple sensors sensing several things. You want to optimize this algorithm across these sensors, and these sensors are actually in different fields. They are actually collecting different kinds of data for a similar problem. So can you just use the same model, right? So that kind of leads you to this federated learning kind of things in an IoT setting, which is again something, uh, I mean, as a future research, that is something which people can look at. Again, this is again an interesting problem, which you may not think it is. But so, for example, when onion is cultivated, it has to be stored and transmitted. Of course, most of you would have seen in news, the onion prices suddenly go high or suddenly go low, just because you either have a lot of onions stored and you cannot use them, or you just don't have any onion, right? So that itself is a problem that is predicting cost, but that's not IoT. But in this case, uh, a, a good quality onion storage system would need a good IoT system. If it is small scale, maybe it doesn't need. But if it's a very large facility where you have to store large amounts of onion, sensing several parameters of this onion, its humidity, even smell, color, all this, if it can be built into the storage system, you could actually understand a bit about storage and appropriately maybe blow some air to heat it or keep it cool or blow a fan so that it's somewhat loose, right? So what I'm trying to say is just to maintain a good storage system, you will need a good IoT system. So this is for onion. I'm sure this could be same for many other crop, right? So I think if these things can be done at a cost effective way, you can use IoT in several settings to make, I think, even agriculture, if not profitable, maybe at least reduce the losses, right? Because many times in India, after the crop production, the produce going to reach the customers takes a lot of cost. So that cost minimization is also part of an IoT because it involves IoT in agriculture, IoT in transportation, and IoT in other aspects. So I think those were the things which I wanted to kind of say with respect to, uh, let's say, this aspect of how different components of IoT play a role. So with that, I think I'll probably end my talk. So certainly, yes, IoT-based systems are very useful for agriculture applications. But the challenge is, like as I said, you can't use models which are developed in other parts of the world, just run them here. You have to customize them. You have to learn, you have to understand these models, maybe tune them for the local conditions, which involves a lot of data, say, data collection and appropriate labeling. But more critical, this cannot be just done by engineers alone. I think it does need interaction with agriculture scientists and also sometimes the farmers and the government. Not sometimes, it's always the farmers, but the government's role also is critical and they, I think, are supporting. But my concern is that this should not be just kind of, okay, everything is digital, everything is mobile, so let's just go digital. That's not the goal here. I think the goal should be that uh, keep the kind of ground realities in mind, develop things which may have a small impact on farmers, but they should be kind of designed and developed for the local needs, not just use what is there and see if that will help, right? So that's kind of, so which means there are several challenges, both from education, teaching, and as well as research, right? So certainly IoT plays a big role in if digital agriculture is to be, and again, as I said, the one part which India is slightly different is, of course, all countries have it, but India also has a very rich tradition of uh, practices passed on across generations. Is there a way to capture some of it? Because they would have sometimes some scientific things, sometimes they may not, but sometimes they may have. So how to capture the scientific aspects also into this model building? And IoT makes it easy because you can collect enough data. That cannot be a problem. But how to use it is the more challenging thing. So I think with that, I will kind of come to the end of this talk, and thanks for those who are listening still. It's quite late, but yeah, thanks for having me here. Yeah. Any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Participants have any question? Participants may ask or raise their hand for question.
Yeah, I know it's dinner time. So.
Also, we started at 6 o'clock only.
Okay, okay. No, but still people are tired usually, I
Yeah,
think.
obviously,
But
with a long day.
yeah, I think.
No, sir, they are attending, sir.
No,
They are,
I'm not. No, I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying that
Huh?
it's just the time is such that you
Yes,
need a
yes,
lot of conviction to kind of stay alert and do, right.
yes, sir.
This time ATAL FDP organized in evening, 6 to 9.
Okay, okay, yeah. As long as
So,
it's helpful, I think I'm happy.
No, sir, that's why we are getting more people to join, like more than
That is true. That
160,
is true. I
130.
think
Yeah,
during the
that's nice.
day, yeah, they don't. They have
Difficult
many
for,
other
yeah.
things. Yeah, they teaching students, many other exams, labs. Yeah. So I think, yeah,
Yes, sir. I think there
some
is no,
parts of the
yeah, yeah.
slide I can certainly share. Some I may not be easily able to share, but I would. I mean, any questions you have, email, please. I can always reply
Yes,
to
sir.
emails.
We will share
Yeah,
email
I think for those
with
who
you.
are emailing, it may help if you just say something about ATAL FTP in your subject, so that I will pay a little
Yes,
more
yes.
extra attention. Okay, my email ID, I'll just type it here. It's my
Or
email
we will
ID.
share if it is
Yeah, yeah. You can
important.
share
Or
also. That's not a problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay, okay, sir.
sir, one group photo, sir.
Yeah, fine. I'm here.
Please, participant, turn on your camera so we can take
And
one
sir,
group photo.
and sir, can you
Oh,
unshare your screen so that we can have many
yes.
people?
Is it unshared now?
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
A participant, please turn on your camera so we can take photo, group photo with our expert speaker. Please smile.
And
Just a minute. Just a minute. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
yeah, that's
Thank you.
also an IoT application, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you very much, sir. It
Thank
was a
you.
very informative session,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
we'll be
Thank
looking
you.
forward to something like this in the future too, sir.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you.
you, sir. Thank
Bye.
you.